I'd like to know what calls people from that, reading that. Like, after having read it, what are you drawn to?
You know, seemed to me so honorable that these people, the Native Americans here, were so willing to stand up and stand with the Black Lives Matter and feel so strongly about that. But then the bringing it home to what happened to this young man last year, I mean, it was a terrible thing. I don't know. It just pretty shocking, and it's just it makes it much closer, I think, than seeing something on television. It seems much more real. The problems just seem, they're here. They're here.
Yeah, I was shocked to hear about how much police brutality was against First people here in the United States. I didn't realize that. And I think the Black Lives Matters, them coming out and working conjunction and acknowledging it is powerful. And we have to work on this. I mean, we have to work on police brutality. It's just systemic, and they are targeting people of color, and it's just has to stop. You know, I think I had told you, if you were all with me, it's I know of a police department in California that is, and I know somebody firsthand. It's a relative that is part of this, and the FBI warned everybody that the white supremacists are infiltrating our law enforcement, and it's evident. I mean, it's obvious. And there's something, I mean, from the local to state to federal government, we have to work on this. We have to go to meetings. We have to hold our leaders' feet to the fire and say something needs to be done about this. But, you know, we have a larger Native American population on this side of the water, and they've been feeling it for a long time. Obviously, the article, you know, the one thing that was said is that the brutality and inequities experienced by our people and by other communities of color divide us, and they divide our whole country, and they absolutely do. And I think it's done purposefully, and it's unnerving, it's frustrating, and it just makes me so angry. So there you go. I just spilled my guts.
That's good, Karen.
I don't believe that we as white people really understand systemic racism or racism in general. And I think that what we really need to do is what we're doing right now is come together as we call it, the white majority, and determine what it really is and what is really wrong. This is one of the things, Kimmy, that is in the book on the migration of the Black population to the northern part of the country, northern and western part of the country. It begins to give you an understanding of what racism really is, and I think that these kinds of meetings are essential to allow the white majority to understand what the problem really is, because I don't think we really do.
Since
Barbara Golden.
I like the fact that the opinion piece takes into account the fact that different communities of color share similar issues. And I like that, because I think that one way that that all of these inequities continue to exist is that some people are very good at dividing and saying, oh, you just don't want to be them. And usually the them is Black Americans. Immigrants don't want to be Black Americans. Other groups of color who are here don't want to be Black Americans. There's a really excellent book called How the Irish Became White that was written some time ago that talks about that issue, specifically not just about Irish, but how different groups become part of the hierarchy of, as long as somebody else is on the bottom, you're better off. You know, that's where the term model minority came from. Let's just keep you separate from those other people and we will throw out some favors for you. So I was really happy to see that they talked about uniting these different groups. And I wrote down in my notes, who gets to tell the story? Who's telling the story? And I think who tells the story has often determined what story is told and what part of it is told. So that if it's always told through one lens, and that's the lens of middle-class white European Americans, then of course people tell their own story and they tell it to their benefit. And we have to learn to tell other people's stories or listen to them tell their own stories. That's it.
Reed?
One thing that struck me in the column was the discussion of policing. I'm heartened by the fact that it looks like the sort of hashtag defund the police is not raising alarms in many parts of privileged America, that we are actually starting to see that defund the police means reallocate resources in a way that maybe gets the right people to do the right jobs. And they talked about the importance of infusing law enforcement at all levels with reconceptualizing policing. And I think that one of the things that that we can do is to imagine that a lot of de-escalation can happen without having somebody with weapons involved in the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Kimmy?
I think change always begins kind of with the individual. And since we're talking about the Suquamish, we are on Suquamish land and they are closest neighbors. And I'm hoping people will, on Bainbridge Island, will get to know the Suquamish people better by going to the events that are important to them. They have a wonderful museum that we could all be members of. They have a monthly newsletter. They offer classes. They have the journey, and they have they start every the Suquamish days in August with a Chief Seattle gravesite ceremony that's very important to them. So I think if we all just we could empathize with their situation, because it didn't happen just this once with Stony. It's been a recurring theme, racism and the way they've been treated and seen as second-class citizens. And I think if we all understood the history of how whites became to dominate this area, and also how treaties were broken time after time, and we are part of that history. And so I think again, just understanding who our neighbors are and really taking the time to learn about who they are, how they got there, or how we got here and replace them is all important.
Mm-hmm.
Eleanor? You gotta
Right.
unmute
Yeah,
yourself.
I was unmuting myself. I mentioned to you, Ann, last week that it occurred to me in yesterday's Supreme Court decision, which God knows was stunning to me, it would be really interesting to explore with the Suquamish tribe the original treaty that was made with them in two respects. One, to see if it was reasonable or in some sense sensible in the time it was written, to know the myriad ways in which it has no doubt been broken, and to then imagine ways in which we might undo that, as it were. That is, to understand and move forward in a more thoughtful and, legal way.
I read that Supreme Court decision this morning too, and thought the same thing you did. I'm not an attorney, but it seems to me that it opens the door to not only the Squamish tribe, but many, many other tribes in this country to determine the legality of what's going on and how many treaties have been broken, and what exactly did happen in Tucson, or not Tucson, but in Tulsa. I think it opens the door dramatically to the possibility of renegotiating some of these treaties that we had.
Barbara Golden.
There's an excellent book that we read in the book group that I was part of before the pandemic. It is called The Bitter Waters of Medicine Creek. And it's about our first governor, whose name was Isaac, what was his last name? Anybody remember? Anyway, The Bitter Waters of Medicine Creek. And he made his name by settling the tribes in Washington. Isaac Stevens.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Isaac Stevens.
Yep.
And it's an excellent book. It tells you all about what happened to Native American tribes in Washington state and how he was instrumental in setting laws and policies that would be used throughout the country. So I highly recommend the book, The Bitter Waters of Medicine Creek.
Nancy Lewis.
And then also, does anyone know if the Suquamish tribe has a contact person who would be cognizant of their history and able to liaison in terms of making changes now? Is there? I don't know anything about the structure whatsoever.
Yeah,
So,
I know some of the structure from
great.
as the historical museum person.
Yay.
They have something called the cultural. Now I'm not going to remember exactly what it's called. Co-op, the cultural co-op, and if you contact them and make a request for what you'd like, then they will send the cultural educator to connect with you. One of the things that is very good to be heard by the cultural co-op is to have done research, either going to the museum yourself so that you can mention in your request what you saw in the museum, or to go to their website and mention and quote things that you're interested in there. Because what we want to be sensitive to is that, the bridge goes both ways. So having experience, even in the casino, there's tons of history to learn in the casino. And there are things online. They have some incredible 4-minute videos that talk a lot about what's going on. So before reaching out to them to educate us, it's good for us to do all the education we can first, put our request into context, because they have very few cultural educators. Yeah, I mean, they're all so busy and they have tons of requests because there's a mandate to teach about the Suquamish tribe in their territory in all schools, but the government did not give the schools any funding to teach. And so they're getting, their doors are getting knocked on all the time for them to be the educators. So they've produced a lot of things for us to educate ourselves. And I think reading the treaty, I love that idea. I mean, I'd love someone to push me and maybe me and Reed and Anne and Kimmy to do a program after we've read the treaty to bring even, you know, Leonard in or some of the educators in and have a conversation. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. This is Stella. This is the first call that I've joined because the topic really interests me. And I had time that it fit in, but I want to circle back to just a comment that Barbara, you mentioned about Isabel Wilkerson. Yesterday, I listened to a phenomenal podcast on a podcast by Krista Tippett called On Being, where she interviews Isabel. I don't know if you had talked about that before I got on the call, but I would highly recommend it. It's On Being podcast.
We watched that last night as well, and it was really, really outstanding, as is Krista Tippett in general. But this particular one was very, very good.
Yeah.
I highly recommend it as well. If you could email out the actual name, it would be very helpful, I think.
Yeah, I'm trying to capture all the books and podcasts and stuff as best I can, and then I will email it to everybody.
Great. And thank you very much.
I may be wrong, but I'll give it my best shot.
Well, Reed's there.
Thanks, Kimmy.
Oh, I have total faith in you.
Well, you don't have to worry, and if you're wrong, people will tell you.
Exactly.
I want to come back just for a minute, because part of the reason I found the Supreme Court decision stunning was, you know, that it was in favor of the tribe. But at the same time, my friends in Oklahoma are indicating as early as this morning, it also opens the door for Congress to come back and revise their treaty and say, no, the property belongs to the state of Oklahoma. And I would not be surprised if they did that. This is the notion of vigilance, you know, a victory is only the beginning of a solution. It isn't the end. And I suspect that with all of the tribes, that it takes our paying attention to what's happening in our government and how they're handling things to assist in making things right.
Mm-hmm.
So last night, some of us were on a Zoom meeting for the Erase group from Kitsap, the Bainbridge branch. And I was going to send out that information too, because Erase is a local group that has a lot of branches and branches to do different kinds of different levels of action and activities on a lot of different topics. So if you're drawn particularly to police issues, for instance, there is a group that does that work. And if you were really interested in education, racial education, historic education, there's a group that does that work. So I will send that information in the email too. And you can find out, of course, most of it's on Zoom right now, so it doesn't mean you're driving to Bremerton every day. But there are opportunities locally on Bainbridge, as well as in Kitsap, as well as in the state and everywhere else, to participate more directly in an area that you find compelling. And one of the invitations last night that I thought was lovely was to try all the different branches. If you're not exactly sure what you're drawn to most, you are welcome to attend some meetings, find out, read their meeting notes and things like that, and get a sense of what's going on. If if you would like to be more directly active. And some of those things are direct action protests and so forth, but some of them are also writing and doing real investigation work. And sometimes it's interacting more directly with Congress people or with local elected officials. So, Kimmy, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, in the opinion page that the Suquamish tribal letter was in, the Kitsap Sun, right?
Yes.
Argus had an opinion. Actually, it was a joint response, but they had to put it under one name. And it's called How Kitsap Can Move Forward After a Week of Solidarity. And if you just go on that link, it has not only the introduction, but it has all of the things that were mentioned last night on the BI Erase meeting, which was, you left early, Anne.
I had another meeting at 8:30.
Yeah, it went on for like 2.5 hours, but so it's succinct, so people can just have it on one page, and there's a little introduction, and it's for it generalizes and puts it into context. So, but I would invite all of you to become members of, I mean, it just means you're interested and you tell them you would like to explore the meetings or their materials, and they will put you in, and you have access to a lot of information.
Kimmy, what was the title of the piece that you mentioned?
It's called How Kitsap Can Move Forward After a Week of Solidarity.
Yeah, okay.
Published on June 11th.
I am happy to put a link of that in an email to anybody that we have the emails for. And if I don't have your email, just send a note to info@biseniorcenter.org, and I'll put you on the mailing list.
Thanks, Reed.
It's an excellent article, and I've been sending it to any number of people because it gives specific things that can be done. And so if you're going to contact government officials of various levels and say, do something, I mean, this is concrete. It isn't just something has to be done. It says this is what can be done, and is at least a really good starting place for that kind of activity.
I'm kind of interested in hearing from some of the high school students if you have anything you would like to bring forward to us. Yes, go ahead.
I was just thinking about the end of the article and how it talked about how it's not too late to have like respectful coexistence between like the tribes and other people now living here. And I think that maybe someone had a comment about this earlier on in the meeting, but that money from defunding the police could be allocated to preserving Native culture more, because the whole just the shooting of Stonechild Chief Stick in Poulsbo, I think really illustrated how we're not really at a place that we need to be in the Pacific Northwest in relations between Native tribes and other people. But it's also not impossible to get to a place of tolerance, but it's going to take a lot of work.
Lena, would you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I really liked how Sophie phrased that. I also, when reading the article, I feel like I learned a lot. I didn't know that police brutality so greatly affected the Native community as well until I really kind of like read the article and looked into it. And I'm so glad that I did, because like now I feel like I'm looking even deeper into like more resources to see how I can help. And yeah, I saw the link to that other article in the article. And so I'm looking forward to taking a look at that, and then maybe taking some, or definitely taking some concrete steps forward to change.
I'd be really open to suggestions about other things we can read together and talk about. I feel like this is a really fruitful way to do it. Since we can't meet in person, this is second best, but I love that we can really be thinking about this stuff and talking not just to each other, hopefully, but to our family and friends about it as well. I mean, for me, conversation is really a huge key to change. If we can talk about all kinds of difficult, uncomfortable things, the more we talk about them, the less uncomfortable we get, usually. And I think normalizing this kind of conversation goes a long way toward helping shift. One of the things someone said last night was, we don't have to choose to live in a white supremacist culture. We can make our own culture. We can choose to live in as the least racist way we can possibly muster. And learning how to do that, I think, is part of the task that's laid on us right now. Richard, would you like to say something?
Yes, I certainly would. I've been waiting for an opportunity to expand our conversation, because there's nothing that's been said here that I disagree with, and I totally support everything. But it's all part of what I consider to be the basic major problem in this country, where everybody is not treated the same. Special people like the president are above the law. We have an elite class, and what I'm going to do sometime today is forward something to read that I've received about the 28th Amendment. And this is not the first time I've received it, but since the George Floyd thing has developed, and it's resurfaced again. And the 28th Amendment addresses the fact that congressional people, senators, members of the House of Representatives, there's a whole set of rules for this elite class, and they're treated so different from the rest of us. We're touching on here about the police situation, and I think that this is all great, but the focus should be on treating everybody equally in all regards in this country. So that's what I would like to add to this conversation, because it simply is unjust that everything is allowed to continue to go on and on and on for decades in the fashion that it is. I rest my case.
We're with you.
Well, I think there's a case to be made for the fact that treating people equal might not be enough, that equity sometimes requires something different. I was recently reading that discrimination isn't racist if it creates equity. Discrimination is racist when it creates or supports or continues inequity. And I think part of the point of that was in that Kendi's book about how to be a non-racist, anti-racist, thank you. And I really found that a fascinating idea, that discrimination is part of our human genetic makeup. We discriminate. We are people who weigh and measure. We categorize. That's part of our DNA. But how we use that discrimination makes a huge difference to the world. And I really have been thinking a lot about the fact that equality and equity are not necessarily the same thing. So, and I think about Lyndon Johnson thing many years ago. You can't take chains off someone and put them in a, in line with everyone else and say, okay, the race is fair, now run. We have done such terrible, terrible damage to many cultures. And I think getting to equal is going to take us a lot longer than we think.
I was saying, yes, exactly. And as we all know, if you look at the original documentation, the Constitution, and then the Bill of Rights and everything, it's all there in black and white that everything is supposed to be the same for everybody. But for several hundred years, that has not been the way that the country has operated. And it most certainly seems to be getting even worse in many regards now. So that, I think, is our fundamental problem.
I think it's also important to recognize that at the time that the Constitution was written, like the United States was in a very, very racist place. Like slavery obviously was up and running. And as you know, like white men property owners were the only people in power. So I think it's, there's a lot of arguments to be made about how it obviously says like all men are created equal. But like, how real is that when you look at the time that the writers were living in?
But, I think in that regard, we have to think about the fact that the framers of the Constitution provided for making amendments, and we have made amendments. That the problem is perhaps not the document itself, but the way in which we interpret the document and its amendments in terms of current culture. Our problem really is that we're so diverse that it's hard to frame an answer to any question that includes everyone. And I'm wondering if it isn't a question of saying, we need to include interpretations that respond to the cultures that are being affected by decisions that we make. That is, somebody said, we have to listen. Yes, we have to listen, but beyond listening, we have to hear. We have to hear what people are really saying. We have to hear what matters to them, not in our terms, but in their terms, even when that conflicts with our terms. I wish I had the answer, the resolution to all of that, but I don't.
I wish you did.
Maybe next week.
That's the big picture, but I think in the meantime, we can all find a spot in our minds and in our hearts where we can find a niche that we can move. I mean, some people are more interested in the legal aspect. And so I think if we all just take a look at the list of things that were shared by race and just commit to yourself in this group that you're going to work on one of those things. And maybe when we meet again, I mean, even if it's reading more about something or talking to groups or people that you don't normally reach out to. I think I'm a believer that all these small connections are like ripples, and it'll, rather than trying to go make our government behave in a certain way, certainly we need to do that by voting and speaking up. But I also think that all the little things that we're doing every day, questioning ourselves and we respond, or maybe stopping someone from saying something that offends you and explain why. I mean, all those behaviors, I think, add up, and I think we will become better.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit like exercise. You need to start out by, just stepping outside and going for a walk. And then maybe you run for a little while. So in this case, maybe if somebody says something that is self, supporting of white supremacy, and they may not even know it, but you say something about it, then you have a little more courage to say something again. Or maybe you don't know what you're going to do, but you show up at a particular protest. You decide, okay, somebody's asking, we're going to hold signs at the corner of 305 and Winslow Way. I'll just go do that today. And rather than trying to figure out how to make it all work, because it's all going to work in little pieces. I think you're right, Kimmy.
Emily, do you want anything? Oh, sorry, Barbara, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to respond to some of the comments that have been made. I participated recently in a conversation, it was a Zoom meeting, on compassionate listening. And one of the things that I think is missing so often from these conversations is who feels safe and who doesn't feel safe. We can reach out to the other side, we can try to interrupt racism and all that, but I don't really feel safe doing that. If I'm on the street and some person is spewing hatred, my inclination is to get out of there, not to engage the person, but to leave, because I feel like I was participating in preparedness at an institution. And I feel like if somebody comes in and wants to shoot up a religious place or some other place, they're going to shoot me first because I'm so identifiable as a person of color. So the police are going after certain people because they think they're working on white people's behalf. So it's up to those people who they think they're protecting, whose ideas they think are so important that they need protecting and your bodies need protecting. They're not trying to protect me. So I am not going to put myself on the front lines. And also because of my age, I don't put myself on the front lines. But even as a younger person, when I was like a lot of young people and I thought I was invincible, I would put myself out there. And it has affected my mental and emotional health. And I think that's something that we need to think about. If you're a member of the Suquamish tribe and you look like you're a member of the Suquamish tribe, and I say that because of being in a conversation with a young woman who said no one knows that she's a member of the Suquamish tribe because she has red hair, which she got from her European American mother. So if you look like you're a member of what in this country is called a minority group, you might be subjected to more scrutiny, to more racist comments, to more hatred. And it makes it hard to reach out. And also makes it hard when you do reach out and you're rejected and your mental health and emotional health suffers. One phrase that I like to put out there is, if you cut off a man's legs, don't be surprised if he bleeds on the carpet.
I'm sorry, Barbara, say that again, please.
If you cut off a man's legs, don't be surprised if he bleeds on the carpet.
Thank you.
We had mentioned mentioned before the On Being, Krista Tippett On Being podcast, and I have it here, but don't know how to transfer it over there. But it's a conversation between Robin DiAngelo, DIANGELO, and Resmaa, RESMAA, Makiem, MENAKEM, who is it's a wonderful podcast and discussion of this very issue, and it was brand new on July 9th. So I will try to send that over to you, and so that you can distribute it to everybody. But I would suggest that everybody listen to it because it's really germane to the to this conversation.
So Emily just sent that to read. So Emily, would you like to add anything to this conversation?
Well, it's funny because just before logging into this call, a colleague of mine sent me that link to the podcast and said, you have to listen to this. And I wrote back and said, well, as soon as I'm out of this conversation, I'm going to. So now I have all the more reason. I don't know if I have anything in particular to add. I want to thank you all for letting those of us who are, students and educators at the high school sit in on this conversation, because it's really good for us to hear the different voices and perspectives. I think we all get used to talking with the people that we're used to talking to. And this is just really lovely for us to hear from all of you. It's also interesting for me to think about what Barbara Golden was just saying, and this notion of who feels safe in what circumstances. And one of the things that struck me about that piece we read together was the idea of people walking through downtown Poulsbo with those types of weapons. And I remember when I took the implicit bias test online, it came out that I am actually biased against white people because of that exact type of image. That strikes fear into my heart, but I don't have the same kind of fear that Barbara has. I'm scared, but I'm less likely to be a target. And so I think one of the things I would love to think about is how those of us who are safer or who feel safer in certain circumstances can stand up and act on the behalf of those who aren't. So whether that means that I can go to a protest for somebody who has a compromised immune system and can't go to a protest, but I can be there on their behalf, that's something that I can do. Whether it's I can take a vocal stand for someone else who may be criticized or targeted in a different way, that's something I can do. And so it's something that we talk a lot about on the student equity team is, what are the privileges that we as individuals hold and how can we use those on behalf of others while examining and kind of deepening our own skills, right? So this is just really interesting. And I thank you again for letting us be here today.
Well, I would love to extend an invitation to everybody in that student equity group and to the staff, because one of the pieces I feel is so important to us is to have multi-generational connections like this. And it isn't always easy because, as you say, we talk to the people we talk to, and we all nod. But I think it's really refreshing for all of us to get different perspectives. And I'm particularly interested in supporting younger people who are passionate and interested. And those of us who've been slogging around it for 60 years, it's wonderful to feel that we can pass something on. I think those of us, who started early and kept it up, it's a beautiful feeling that this work will go forward.